Welcome to Mind and Machine, where we explore the science and technology of human performance enhancement. I'm August Bradley. My guest today is Steven Kotler. Steven is one of the world's leading experts on achieving ultimate human performance through flow states. Flow is the cognitive state of full immersion and focus, in which brain activity changes to enable peak human capability across an intellectual or physical activity. It's characterized by rapt attention so deep that one loses their sense of space and time, tapping into radically heightened performance, creativity, and learning. Steven is the executive director of the Flow Research Collective and a New York Times bestselling author. His books include The Rise of Superman, Tomorrowland, and Stealing Fire. Along with Peter Diamandis, he co-authored the books Bold, Abundance, and most recently, The Future is Faster Than You Think. We go deep into the neurological causes of flow states, what it enables, and how to achieve it. If you're inspired by human and technological progress, consider subscribing to the free Mind and Machine newsletter at mindandmachine.io or at the link in the show notes. And it would be incredibly helpful if you could help spread the word about the Mind and Machine podcast and YouTube show. The key to success and sustainability for us is word of mouth from listeners and viewers. I want to enhance our future by sharing essential insight on transformational changes and bringing more people into the conversation. We all need to be a part of shaping this future. Send anyone you think might be interested to mindandmachine.io. Subscribing to the podcast and our YouTube channel helps us build the show and our collective future. Now, let's dive in. Steven, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be with you.
I remember reading Rise of Superman, and I was living in Tahoe at the time, and it just was like a bolt of lightning to me because it articulated so many things that I was feeling living in the mountains and before work climbing mountains and skiing down them and whitewater kayaking and things I didn't even think to try to articulate. You laid out so beautifully, and it made me realize what was happening, what I was chasing. And beyond that, you laid out the science behind it, and it was incredibly eye-opening to me. And then you've gone on to bring this to other fields beyond action sport. Has that been lately your mission to sort of expand the concepts behind the original action sports work?
Action sports was sort of a really small niche. It's where I started, and they were a great tool kind of for exploring flow. The action sport athletes had really managed to harness the state and do something that everybody can sort of wrap their heads around. But, flow has been kind of in every domain imaginable forever, right? Wherever you see paradigm shifting, kind of nothing is ever the same again. Breakthroughs in science, in technology, in the arts, in sports, in action sports, you're seeing flow at work. So that book looked at action sports because it was a great kind of sort of vehicle to tell the story with. But I think I had already been kind of going wide with it already. My work has really focused on trying to decode the neurobiology of flow. So what was laid out in Rise is really just sort of the beginning, and a lot of my focus has been to how push that as far as we possibly can and really kind of decode the whole state.
Well, I think it's really valuable work. So let's dive into it. So for those new to the idea, what is flow? What's the core definition of it?
Yeah, it's technically defined as an optimal state of consciousness when we feel our best and we perform our best. And the synonyms are endless, right? Being in the zone, runner's high. Play basketball, it's being unconscious. If you're a stand-up comic, they call it the forever box. And for most of us, it's experience we're really familiar with. It's those moments of rapt attention and total absorption when you get so focused on what you're doing on the task at hand that everything else just seems to disappear. Action awareness will merge. Time will dilate, which is a fancy way of saying it passes strangely. So sometimes it'll slow down. You'll get a freeze frame effect from it. And if you've been in a car crash, more frequently it speeds up. And 5 hours will pass by in like 5 minutes. And throughout, all aspects of performance, both mental and physical, go through the roof.
Okay. I think those are experiences that virtually anyone, I would actually go so far as to say anyone can relate to, that moment where either you lost yourself in time or time just froze, like the car crash example or any peak action sport moment. I think that's super relatable. But again, I don't think a lot of people think about trying to articulate what's behind that. But you've gone so deep as to lay out the neurobiology behind it. And that's really fascinating to me. Can you talk about the elements such as the transient hypofrontality
Sure, for sure.
and all that?
Yeah. Flow science is actually pretty old. It dates back to like the 1870s. And so progress was sort of stop and start until a guy named Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who was the chairman of the University of Chicago Psychology Department, came along in the 70s. And he coined the term flow, and he made a number of kind of core psychological discoveries. He discovered that the state has 6 core phenomenological characteristics, ways the state makes us feel. And from that point on, we have slowly started kind of peeling back the hood on the neuroscience, what's going on underneath all this stuff. And, appropriate for this podcast, of course, is that, neuroscience, biotech as a field is accelerating. Genomics is 4 times the speed of Moore's law some years at this point, right? Neuroscience is going along for the ride, and our imaging technologies are getting better and better and better. And so starting roughly around the turn of the century, around the early 2000s, we started really being able to see what's going on in the brain. And when we're in this experience, and sort of when you talk about neuroscience, right, you want to really talk about 4 things. And I'm not going to talk about all 4, but I'm just going to lay them out so we can know what I'm skipping. You want to know neural anatomy and networks, which is where things in the brain are taking place, right? Neural anatomy, the precise location. Nothing in the brain works alone. Everything's pretty much a connected network. So those are the 2 like location things. And then you want to understand neurochemistry and neuroelectricity, which are the 2 ways the brain communicates with itself, with the body, right? And so flow, like pretty much any altered state of consciousness, but flow is a profound shift in standard brain function. So I'll give you just I'll run through a handful of things that happen. So your brain waves shift. So normally right now, you and I are having a conversation. Our brain waves are in beta. It's a fast moving wave. It's where we are when we're awake, when we're alert, paying attention, that sort of thing. If I get you anxious or I get anxious, right, that's high beta. That's even faster. Below beta is a slower moving wave, alpha. That's daydreaming mode. It's sort of the brain when it's resting. And below that, slower wave is theta. And theta tends to show up most frequently when we're in REM sleep or the hypnagogic state and falling asleep. And one of the ways alpha is characterized through daydreaming, right? You're moving from thought to thought without a lot of internal resistance. At theta, there's no resistance at all. This is like you're falling asleep and you're dreaming, you're thinking about, oh, I got to hang up my green sweater, and it becomes a green turtle and a green ocean and a green planet, and right, then there's no resistance between ideas. So flow takes place on the borderline between alpha and theta. So it's a very altered state of being. We also see, as you pointed out, transient hypofrontality, which means that when we move into flow, and this is so let me back into this. The older idea about high performance, you're familiar with, it's the 10% brain myth. It's that idea we're only using 10% of our brain at any one time. So peak performance, aka flow, it's got to be the full brain on overdrive, right? And it turns out we had it totally backwards. In flow, we're not using more of the brain, we're actually using less of the brain. It's sort of an efficiency exchange. The brain has a limited energy budget and it uses a ton of energy. So the first order of business for the brain is always, can I conserve energy at any point? Efficiency is really important. So in flow, we need a lot of extra energy for focus. Attention is really tight in the present moment. So the brain says, okay, you need energy for focus. Let's shut off non-critical structures and we'll give you that energy. And this isn't all that uncommon. The brain tends to do it every now and again. But in flow, huge portions of the prefrontal cortex shut down. So transient means temporary. Hypofrontality, hypo, H-Y-P-O, it's the opposite of hyper. It means to slow down. And frontality, prefrontal cortex. So the term you were talking about, transient hypofrontality, means the temporary deactivation of large swatches of the prefrontal cortex. And so this explains some flow's really peculiar effects, right? You were talking earlier about time dilation and time passing strangely. This happens because time is actually calculated all over the prefrontal cortex. It's sort of a network effect, a bunch of different structures working together. And like any network, right, as nodes start to collapse, the whole system goes down. And what this means is in flow, you lose the ability to separate past from present from future, and everything's crunched down into what psychologist Philip Zimbardo nicknamed the deep now, the eternal present, right? And this has huge impacts on performance and cognition and all that stuff. But that's the transient hypofrontality. And finally, there's a huge shift in neurochemistry in the brain. You get 5 of the most potent sort of reward neurochemicals: dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, and anandamide. So oxytocin, so it may be 6. There's a debate, and we're actually doing some research at the Flow Research Collective to try to get at that. And I think I left endorphins were the one I left out. I might have screwed that up for you. But anyways, you get this huge kind of dump of neurochemicals. And these chemicals do all kinds of stuff. What I like to talk about, what I think is the coolest, is what they do to the brain's ability to process information. So they literally surround information processing. When I talk about flow as mental high performance, one of the many reasons is when you're in the state, we take in more information per second. So data acquisition goes up. We pay more attention to that information. So salience increases. We find faster connections between that incoming information and older ideas. So pattern recognition goes up. We find faster connections between the incoming information and really far-flung outside the box ideas. So lateral thinking goes up. So we're really seeing the entire process being surrounded, which is why, for example, creativity spikes so much when we're in flow, or learning as well. Quick shorthand for how learning works in the brain is the more neurochemicals that show up during an experience, the better chance it'll move from short-term holding into long-term storage. Flow is this huge neurochemical dump. So we see big spikes in learning. That's sort of like just the loose map. There's a ton more going on, and that's really just a mini picture of sort of all the stuff that's going on. In fact, I'm right now working on a research project with a team at Stanford, and we're trying to map just the changes that take place in the brain over the first 2 seconds of flow. Literally just like the moment that you drop into flow, what's going on. And it's enormously complicated. There's a whole lot more going on than anything I just sort of laid out for you. But that's a rough approximation. It's a good place to start.
But that is fascinating. And there was so much there. So I want to dive into some parts of that. So the idea of the frontal part of the brain minimizing, you're right. My instinct would have been that the brain is expanding its capabilities, but shutting down and minimizing to do fewer things deeper and better. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah. So flow is really what happens when we trade conscious processing for subconscious processing, right? And the conscious mind is powerful for sure, but it's limited. It's got a limited RAM. It can only hold on to 7 plus or minus 1 items at once. And most of us, if we're holding on to really complicated ideas, tap out around 4. The subconscious, really unlimited RAM. Processing speed of conscious thought is very slow. Subconscious is much faster. And the subconscious is also much more energy efficient. So we're passing it over. The only way we can do that is with like automatized programming. So stuff we've learned so well, right? We know all the moves, so the subconscious can sort of run the show at much higher speeds. So
that sensation of oneness comes out of this. You've articulated
the sensation of oneness with everything.
Yeah, so losing yourself and connecting with space around you.
So oneness is different than losing yourself. The losing yourself is a combination of the merger and action and awareness and the sort of deactivation of the prefrontal cortex. That's sort of when self disappears. Oneness with everything takes place when that shutdown moves out of the prefrontal cortex and moves into a spot like right over here over your right ear, the right temporal lobe, which my colleague Andrew Newberg nicknamed the object association area. Essentially, it's a part of a brain that helps you separate self from other, which sounds weird, but like if you got to walk through a crowded room, you sort of got to have a felt sense of this is where I am, this is where the rest of the world begins. So people who have a stroke or brain damage, this part of the brain, they can't sit down on a couch because they're not quite sure where does my leg end and where does the couch begin. So during moments of extreme concentration, right, as happens in flow, that efficiency exchange moves deeper into the brain and this portion of the brain will shut down. And when it shuts down, you can't separate self from other. And at that point, the brain concludes you are one with everything. But you tend to be one with whatever it is you're focusing on, right? So if you're rock climbing, you become one with the crack. And if you're skiing, you're one with the mountain. If you're surfing, you're one with the wave. And if you're painting, you're one with the painting. And if I'm writing, I'm one with the words and blah, blah, blah. And if you're meditating on, infinite nothingness, then you're one with the universe.
That's an actual biochemical phenomenon, not just some sensation.
Yeah, it was discovered. The first time we uncovered it was back in the 50s. A brilliant neurosurgeon, Wilder Penfield. He was a Canadian neurosurgeon, and he was developing a new procedure for epilepsy, where they had opened up the skull and they were probing with an electrode to try to stimulate an aura. An aura is like it's a sensory shift that precedes an epileptic seizure. And so it'll usually, the people will smell burnt toast, or see colors, things like that. And it happens right before an epileptic seizure. So Penfield was sort of probing the brains of patients, trying to figure out what's going to trigger the aura so he could figure out what to remove from the brain, right, to kind of cure epilepsy in these patients. And so he was sort of mapping the brain. We learned a ton about the brain through his work. But when he started stimulating the right temporal lobe, patients started reporting all kinds of crazy mystical experiences, out-of-body experiences, and some of the near-death experience things that were happening. And they would have hallucinations and see visions or sense presence, that feeling of like a ghost being in the room with you. That's all right temporal lobe phenomenon. And it's gotten so cool. So people have built artificial machines that can stimulate this and trigger this in people, so you can have this experience. In fact, in Peter Brugger's lab in Switzerland, at the University of it may be the University of Geneva. I may get it wrong, but they've got a VR simulation that can do this.
Oh, wow.
Can sort of induce out of body experiences in people. It's getting really interesting, because we're really sort of mapping the biology behind a lot of these things. And it also points out, like, there's stuff that we can't find at all, right? You hear people in the New Age talk about energy or chi, kundalini, all the freaking time, right? We've looked for, like, over the past 50 years, we've gotten really good at this. We've looked at pretty much almost every mystical experience you can imagine. I mean, speaking in tongues, I can tell you the neurobiology of where that comes from.
Oh, wow.
On and on and on, except for energy, chi. And maybe it's because our measurement technology isn't subtle enough, could be, or maybe it's just a fairy tale.
Right. Fair enough. Well, it's amazing how far you've come, because I wouldn't have thought that the neuroscience would have backed a lot of that up, but apparently it does. So similarly, the idea of becoming completely in the present and losing the sense of future and past is part of the brain shutting down too. Different, first we were talking about space minimizing, now we're talking about time minimizing. And that completely dovetails with the objective of meditation, to become completely present. I assume that's the same phenomenon happening in the brain?
No, it's similar, related phenomenon. So one of the key differences is, and the research goes both ways on this, but I'll tell it to you how I think it is, and I could be wrong. But so in flow, a part of your brain known as the medial prefrontal cortex, right here, middle of the forehead, seems to get hyperactive. It's the only part of the prefrontal cortex that seems to get active. It does a lot of different things, but in this particular case, it does what you could call creative self-expression, and it gets really active in flow, because flow is an active state, right? It is a decision-making state. It's defined as flow because every action, every decision that flows seamlessly, effortlessly, perfectly from the last. This was Csikszentmihalyi's work. That's where the term came from. So for that to happen, you're obviously making decisions as an action state. In meditation, the goal is for self to disappear. So what we see then is that this portion of the brain also shuts down. So there are differences between flow and meditation. And there's a variety of altered states of consciousness, and they're all, different parts of the brain are turning on and off. The same sort of neurochemicals that we were talking about earlier. Some of them are poking through in meditation, though I think there's a huge neurochemical difference between meditation and flow. I haven't seen anything that tells me otherwise. The brain waves and the neural anatomy stuff, same, but the neurochemistry seems to be pretty different.
Now, let's talk about a little bit about the 4 stages of flow so people can start understanding how to recognize where they are in this process,
Sure.
the struggle, release, flow state, recovery. What characterizes these 4 stages?
We used to think that flow was a binary experience, right? You're either in the zone or you're out of the zone. Works like a light switch. And what we've since learned, and this is it started. The first person I saw who worked on this was Herb Benson at Harvard. He's a cardiologist. Did some of the foundational meditation work, speaking of meditation, and then sort of turned his attention to flow. And he found that flow has 4 different stages, and it's actually a cycle. And you have to move through each of these stages to get to the next one. So flow starts off in what's known as a struggle phase, and this is either it can be very short end and like the fight response in a fight or flight response, where like suddenly the work you're doing demands all like a much bigger reaction, right, than you were used to. It's just like I'll give you a skiing example, right? It's like you pull onto the slope and like you got a huge bump field in front of you, and you suddenly realize how much work it's going to take to get from top to bottom, and you're like, "Argh!" And you sort of dive into it, right? That always
Yep.
seems to take place at the front of flow. Often, by the way, this struggle phase can last for a really long time as you're loading the brain and then overloading the brain with information, right? When you're skill acquisition and things along those lines, because you have to internalize the skills for them to all like be able to be automatized and come together. So this is the struggle phase at the front end, and there are ways to move through it more gracefully and more quickly, but it doesn't appear that there's any way to avoid it at all. That is followed by a release phase. If you have done any creativity research, you know that creativity preparation phase, there's an incubation phase before there's the insight, what they call the illumination phase. Same thing when flow. You go from thinking about the problem really hard. In struggle, prefrontal cortex is really active. Then you got to take your mind off the problem. Second phase is called release. This is literally like you need to distract yourself. And low-grade physical activity tends to work really, really well to move this transition along. And, throughout history, different people had all kinds of different techniques. I like long walks. That's a very effective release technique for me. Albert Einstein famously used to like to sail into the middle of Lake Geneva and sort of stare at the clouds. Funny story, Einstein couldn't sail. He was
Oh, wow.
addicted to doing this. Couldn't swim at all, and he could barely sail. So apparently he was rescued like once every 2 weeks out of the middle of Lake Geneva,
Oh, that's great.
which is hysterical. Right? Nobody knows that. I think that's pretty funny.
I
So
just
yeah,
can't
there's this
picture
release
Einstein
phase.
being
Then
rescued out there.
right, rescued. At the third phase
Wait,
of
just quickly,
the
we should note for those trying to learn, TV does not do the release state, right?
oh
TV is
yeah,
not a solution.
important safety tips. So seems to be that release requires sort of the brain shifting into alpha, right? That sort of you're in beta in struggle, and it seems like the brain is going to shift towards alpha. And what happens with TV is every time an image shifts on TV, right? Like TV is all about fast cuts, and fast cuts is how they hold our attention. And even though while you're sitting in front of the television and vegging out, and it feels like I'm totally relaxed, and your brain will drop into alpha, right? It'll do that, but every time that image switches, it spikes up into beta really quickly, and that blocks the release phase. So, yeah, almost anything works there, but TV. That doesn't tend to work. The third stage itself is the flow state itself, and right, the big high. And that is followed by a deep low, right? There's a recovery phase. Flow is an expensive state for the body to produce, requires a lot of energy. Some of those neurochemicals we get produced, they take a little while to replenish if you burn through them. And so on the back end of a flow state, there's a recovery phase. And so, I've said this before, but like, it doesn't happen quite so much anymore, but it used to happen a lot when I first started doing this work. People would come up to me and they'd say, Steven, you absolutely have to study me. I'm in flow all the time. And I never knew what to say. And then I just started telling the truth, which is, well, we have a word for that. We call that schizophrenia. or mania. Take your pick. You can't.
Too
So
much
there's
of a
no
good
such
thing.
thing as a permanent flow state, right? You can't stay in a permanent flow state because there's different neurobiological changes underneath each of these stages of the cycle. So you have to move through the neurobiological changes to sort of make your way around the wheel.
Okay, fantastic. Now, flow is also highly addictive. It's like chemicals, drugs can be addictive. And therefore, I've seen you make the connection that it's a source of intrinsic motivation that can sort of drive behaviors in a certain direction. Is that a fair summary? And how does that work?
I said earlier that Csikszentmihalyi came up with 6 characteristics of flow. One of them is that the experience is autotelic. Autotelic is a fancy word for an end in itself. When something is autotelic, it means we'll go really far of our way just to get more of it, right? And what it means more specifically is what you just said. Flow is sort of the source code of intrinsic motivation. And once again, as you pointed out, it does come down to those neurochemicals. First of all, when the prefrontal cortex turns off, uh, your inner critic, that nagging defeatist voice in your head gets turned off. So we really experience that as joy and pleasure in and of itself. That alone is really pleasurable. But you add to it, you get these 5 extremely potent neurochemicals, and they're all feel-good chemicals. So just to give you a simple example, endorphins are is short for internal endorphins or internal opiates, basically, right? So our endorphins are internal versions of external drugs like morphine or heroin or et cetera, et cetera. Just to give you an idea of how powerful, there are about 20 different endorphins in the brain. The most common one is 100 times more potent than medical morphine.
Oh,
So
wow.
really, really powerful. And just to put this in context, for example, I said you get 5 neurochemicals in flow. Romantic love, like falling in love, one of our favorite feelings. Helen Fisher at Rutgers figured out that that's predominantly norepinephrine and dopamine, 2 of the chemicals you get in flow. So norepinephrine and dopamine plus endorphins, which are 100 times more potent than medical morphine, and a couple other chemicals. So this is an enormous high. We love it. Researchers have found that people will name flow and group flow, which is the shared team collective version of a flow state, as their most favorite experiences on Earth over and over again. The people who score off the charts for overall well-being and life satisfaction are the people with the most flow in their lives. High flow, positive psychologists have spent a lot of time sort of looking at happiness lately, and they now know there are the highest 3 levels of happiness you can have on the planet. There's day-to-day happiness, which is sort of the bottom. Above that is a life of engagement. This is a high flow lifestyle. So the lifestyle you were leading when you were in Tahoe, you were skiing a lot, you were climbing a lot, high flow lifestyle. If you take a high flow lifestyle and couple it to purpose, right? If the thing that's creating flow for you is also tied to something bigger than yourself, that's the best we get to feel on the planet. Right. This is 25 years of positive psychology, and that's what we know for
It's the
sure.
peak. Yeah, peak experiences.
It's a huge up, and as you pointed out, it's very addictive, right? Dopamine, the most addictive drug on earth is cocaine, and all that cocaine does is essentially force the brain to release all of its dopamine, right, and block its reuptake. So you're getting cocaine and all these others, endorphins are opiates, and the list sort of goes on. These are very addictive substances, and the neurochemical version, the internal version, is sort of just as addictive. In fact, the funny thing about it is if you were to try to mimic flow with street drugs, you'd end up dead or in a coma. You couldn't do it. Like you literally would overdose.
It's just
You
too
couldn't
much.
cocktail
Yeah.
them. It's too much, and they wouldn't blend together, and they would end up killing you. But the brain does it just fine, right? Like the brain does it
Right.
really, really well. So yeah, flow's a really addictive state, and you see this. Abraham Maslow years ago said that he was absolutely convinced that flow prevents suicide. And I think that's very true. I think it redeems a lot of the hard work. But I also think when you get locked out of flow, right? And this happens. I'll give you 2 simple examples. So, simple example: Startups generate tremendous amount of flow. There's a lot of reasons why. We could talk about those, but startups generate a lot of flow. But a lot of those reasons start to disappear as companies calcify, right? They could move from startup to I'm now an established company, and a lot of the things that were producing that high flow environment are now gone. And so you see founders, right, who are really addicted to those flow chemicals go, oh yeah, I'm going to start another company. Like, I'll give you a simple example. My partner, Peter Diamandis, who I've written, 3 books with, Peter's on his 22nd company right now. And, a lot of that is he wants to enact a lot of change in the world, but part of it is he's really addicted to the flow that comes from starting things.
Let's touch on some of the things that generate flow from entrepreneurial or startup activity.
So we have figured out that flow states have triggers, preconditions that lead to more flow. And there's but 22 in total. There's 10 that have been isolated for group flow, depending on how you count. The guy, Keith Sawyer's at the University of North Carolina. Originally, there were 10, then he became 7. I think he's expanded it out to 9. He's got a new book out. I'm sure it changed again, but whatever. And then there are 12 known triggers for regular flow. There are probably a lot more that we haven't found. And they all do the same thing. Flow follows focus. So all these triggers drive attention to the present moment, right? And if I were to say it neurobiologically, I would say the triggers do what we think one of 3 things. Is they either drive norepinephrine and dopamine into your system, the 2 of the neurochemicals we've been talking about that do a lot of different things, feel good things and whatever, but they also drive focus. That's one of their predominant things that are 2 main focusing chemicals. So
the flow drives focus, or you need to have focus to trigger the flow?
Flow drives focus a little bit, but you need focus to trigger flow. And so that's what the triggers do. They drive focus.
Okay.
Or they drive the neurochemicals that drive focus. So for example, why did you get so much flow as an athlete in Tahoe, for example, where we started? One of the reasons is risk is a flow trigger because it produces a tremendous amount of dopamine and it drives a lot of focus. And of course, it doesn't have to be physical risk. You can use social risk or emotional risk or spiritual, right? All these things also drive dopamine and drive focus. So that's just one example. There are dozens.
High stakes, high consequences.
High consequences. High consequences is one flow trigger. Novelty, complexity, unpredictability. 3 other flow triggers. And all of those do the same thing. Also, they all produce huge spikes in dopamine. This is Robert Sapolsky's work at Stanford. But those huge spikes in dopamine drive focus. So we've all had this experience where you've gone traveling, right? You're in a foreign country and you're in a deep flow state. Why? It's because there's so much novelty everywhere, right? Every time you're noticing something new, you're getting a little bit of dopamine, a little bit more dopamine, a little bit more dopamine, and it's starting to drive you into flow. So there are a bunch more, and basically if you're interested in kind of increasing the amount of flow in your life, over and over, just build your life around these triggers. That's what we see again and again. Companies.
How would you build a lifestyle around flow triggers if you wanted to go all in on
this? So the first place I'd start, I always say that there are 2 things that are most important, and they're going to seem really diametrically opposed, but everybody has. Most people tend to have a primary flow activity and a secondary flow activity. So my primary flow activity is I get the most flow when I'm skiing, right? It's the most consistent. 90% of the time I go skiing, I'm in a flow state, right? Probably the second activity for me is writing, right? I'd say 50-60% of the time when I sit down to write, I'm in a flow state. So, but what happens is with our primary flow activities is as we get older, right, we tend to put them down. We do them a lot less. We focus on our careers more. We focus on our families more. And so the simplest thing in the world is to put that back in your life. And that one of the reasons is flow is essentially a focusing skill. It's the brain focusing in a very particular way. And it's like any other focusing skill, like meditation, right? The more flow you get, the more flow you get. So if you start getting a ton of flow while skiing, for example, it's going to start leaking into your work life. It's going to start bleeding over a little bit, and that's going to help. So I always say, like, the first thing you should do is go back to the thing that you were probably already doing a long time ago, and you stopped because you grew up, and it's really the dumbest thing you can do, for a lot of different performance reasons. So, but that's one. And now let's talk about the total opposite side, which is flow follows focus. Complete concentration is one of the most important flow triggers. And so, and when I work with organizations, and when we work with organizations, we always go in and we say, look, if you can't hang a sign on your door that says "fuck off, I'm flowing," you cannot do this work. What the research consistently shows is 90 to 120 minutes of uninterrupted concentration is how you maximize flow. And so what we recommend to everybody is that unless you're a night owl, like unless you wake up late at night, and then you have to do this when you're starting to wake up, but most people are kind of most awake, most able to focus, most clear-headed first thing in the morning. So we always say start with your hardest task. Devote 90 to 120 minutes to your hardest task first, and shut everything else out, right? I suggest, I tell people to practice distraction management the night before. So I start writing every day at 4 o'clock in the morning. But when I finish work, the night before at 6 or 7 o'clock at night, I shut everything down. My email gets down, my phone gets unplugged, everything gets turned off. Oftentimes, I'll bring up whatever it is I'm writing, and I'll leave my computer in focus view. So the only thing, everything's blacked out but the words. And I keep the lights off in my office, and it's literally just me and the words, and there's nothing else. We tend to get, so there's this idea, it's worth only talking about this a little bit. Back in 2009, I'm going to blank the guy's name. I really apologize. The guy who created Y Combinator wrote this phenomenal article where he talked about having a maker's schedule versus a manager's schedule. And a maker's schedule is sort of what I'm talking about, long periods of uninterrupted concentration where you can focus on the task. And a manager's schedule, which is where your life is divided into 5-minute chunks, and usually those chunks belong to somebody else because you're on the phone or you're sending an email or you're in a meeting, that sort of thing. And manager schedules are kind of disastrous for flow. And the other thing is, I work with a lot of people who are like, but that's how I work. That's what I got to do. I'm a manager, right? And I always point out, I'm like, I've gotten to work with some of the world's greatest managers, like really like world-class, best ever kind of folks. And they're always the first people to point out that, like, hey man, there's a difference between working to feel like you're busy and doing a manager's job. Manager's job is to manage things and make them better. And if you're not spending 90 minutes thinking about how to do that at the start of your day, you're probably not a good manager. And so I like to point that out, because where this gets pushed back is from people who are like, I'm being tugged everywhere. And I'm like, well, okay, that's fair enough. That absolutely happens. There are fixes for that. But if you really want to amplify the amount of flow in your life, I still think the two biggest things you can do is go back to the thing that you were doing, rekindle that. What it will do, by the way, is it will reignite intrinsic motivation massively also. That's a really big deal. The fires inside will just start burning so much hotter. Couple that and the little bit of flow training you're getting doing your primary flow activity with 90 to 120 minutes of uninterrupted concentration to start your day, you're going to massively increase the amount of flow in your life. And just the changes from those two things alone will be earth-shattering.
Right. So on a practical level, you probably advocate blocking off, just reserving big chunks on the schedule ahead of time, like just locking it down, not just trying to find it.
No, I do. In fact, it's funny. I just blocked out. I will do it like I block out any things where I'm like, my schedule right now for the next 2 weeks. It's got my 4 a.m. writing session for 4 hours, and it's got another block. I'm writing an article for the Wall Street Journal, and they've got an hour a day for the next 6 days. And then I'm doing a big training in January, and that requires 90 minutes a day. And I'm looking at my schedule. My assistant just sort of sent me my new schedule, and it's all for the next 2 weeks. Those things are calendared out. So yeah, I do calendar that stuff in ahead of time. I also, I really tend to believe this, and a lot of people will disagree with me, but I think people have meetings because they want to feel useful, right? Meetings, talking, it feels like you're working, but I've run a lot of companies. I've started a lot of companies. I've worked for a lot of startups. I've, blah, blah, blah. I very rarely, very rarely does anything really get done in a meeting. If there's more than two people in a meeting or three people in a meeting, you're wasting time anyways, in my opinion. I rarely see those meetings lead anywhere. And I think most people feel the same. So I really hold to this, and I really do think it's the two biggest things you can do to make a difference.
Yeah, I feel the same way regarding meetings. I've heard you also say that mastery looks like a checklist. Like just on the outside looking in, it's just this discipline and an ordinary checklist.
Yeah. So it's a flow trigger thing into another idea. So one of flow's another flow trigger is known as clear goals. Flow follows focus, right? So you want all your attention in the present moment. A clear goal, this is not like a massively transformative purpose or a high hard goal, or it's literally like, what am I doing now? What am I doing next? So for example, my writing goal, right? I have to start my day with a 4-hour writing session. I'm finishing a book now, so I usually like to write more when I'm finishing a book. So my goal is 850 to 1,000 words a day in my book, right? That's a clear goal. I know exactly what I'm doing, and I know, right, when it's done, what victory looks like. This is also really important. If you're massively overwhelmed, one of the best things you could possibly do is create a clear goals list. And for a clear goals list, spend a couple weeks trying to figure out how many things on average can you do super well in a day. For me, it's between 7 and 9, depending on how hard the tasks are. And this is working like from 4 a.m. to usually to like 5 o'clock in the evening, right? I'll take time out to get exercise and do things like that. But like that's just what I can do and be really excellent at in a given day. So a clear goal list is figure out how many things you can be excellent at in a day. And then at the end of the day, when I do distraction management, I make a clear goal list for the next day because it keeps me focused. I know what I'm doing. I know what I have to do next. There's no gap in between also. There's no like, I don't have to look at my list and go, oh, what am I going to do next? Maybe I should check Facebook or send an email. No, I go from task to task. I don't even, one of the things that does is you don't pop out of flow as much, right? Because you're not dicking around in between. But where this leads is, and I think this is true over and over, I spent my career, in every field imaginable, studying those moments when the impossible becomes possible, right? I've over and over and over again, I've looked at super high peak performers, and 98% of the time, high performance is a checklist. It's I wake up in the morning, I do every item on my clear goal list as best as I possibly can. I have an active recovery protocol at the end of the day, right, to prevent me from burning out. I get some exercise. I've got social support sort of built into my life, meaning like I know enough to talk to my girlfriend or my wife or my boyfriend or my father or my friend. Like you have some social support, like, and then repeat over and over and over again, right? Like the thing about peak performance and, high achievement that's so counterintuitive is there's no hard work literally is the secret, right? And it's really just the ability to do everything on your checklist over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, week after week after week after week after week. That's the secret, and that's why flow is so important. That's what I meant earlier when I said flow redeems the hard work. It's this enormous high, and it redeems the fact that peak performance is a checklist, right? You cannot, if you're just doing the checklist without flow, you've got a recipe for burnout. That's exactly how you burn out, right? Flow is what redeems that.
So you're not just getting loose and falling into it. It's work, it's focus, it's discipline, it's an effort to achieve flow routinely.
I think that's very true. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And now how do you maintain flow when transitioning from task to task? It seems like once you're in it, a switch is just going to kill it.
Yeah, you're not entirely wrong. That is definitely right. And you got to really manage for distractions, right? There was a study done 4 or 5 years ago in coders and flow, obviously really important. And they found that simply knocking on a coder's door, knocking him out of flow just by like, hello, don't even have to like, right? It'll knock you out for about 15 minutes minimum if you can get back in it at all. So there's a cause for distraction. What I like to do is I sort of just gave it away is I do not What you don't want to do is get your prefrontal cortex involved, right? So you don't want to have any flow is very emotionally neutral, even though it feels really good. It's affectively neutral. Emotions help you steer, right? But in flow, every decision, every action is flowing seamlessly, perfectly, effortlessly. Like you're already dialed in. You don't need emotions to help you steer. As a result, that portion of the brain, the inner critic, all that stuff can stay quiet. So the worst thing you could do is check social media, by the way. The worst thing you could do in between, because what I say is if you have items on your clear goal list, the best thing to practice is being able to go from item 1 to item 2 to item 3 without, like, you just go from one to the next. And that's the discipline it's very unusual for people. We're not used to going from task to task seamlessly. People want a little break. But it pulls you out of flow, right? Unless you're really cautious with it. And social media, I think, is the worst because it tugs on you emotionally. You didn't get the like you wanted, right? That's actually exerting a cost. Or if you got the like you wanted, that's charging you up with dopamine and making you want to check it more. And now you're distracting and multitasking, and emotions are going, and you're no longer in flow. So one of the things I like to do is really sort of try to go from task to task seamlessly, and I get a kick out of it. Like I have a blast trying to see how much should I can actually get done before breakfast, right? How many things before before my day even starts? Like what
Sort of
can I
gamify it
actually?
and as a challenge.
Yeah. I just like it that way. There used to be it was an army ad from years ago that said we get more done before 9 a.m. than most people do all day. And I like to just get more done before 7 a.m. than most people do. You know what I mean? That kind of thing.
That's awesome.
It's fun.
So before we wrap up, just one sort of slight tangent, but you're just the perfect person to ask this. This is something that interests me greatly. You've very recently, written a science fiction novel called The Last Tango in Cyberspace. And you've also written a fascinating book called Tomorrowland, Our Journey from Science Fiction to Science Fact, which is a collection of essays and articles. And I am really interested in how influential science fiction has been in shaping real world science. I interview a lot of scientists and leading edge engineers, and consistently science fiction books and movies influenced them and led to them doing what they're doing. How do you see?
First of all, I work with Peter Diamandis, who will always say, Peter loves to say, when I was a kid, I got, I was shown what the future could hold by this wonderful dark documentary of the future called Star Trek, right? I mean, like over and over and over again, you see that. I think there's a reason for this, though, right? Like words are how we turn thoughts into things, right? Like a lot of what we create is about how do you turn a thought into a thing, and it transitions through language, right? We literally that's the first way we capture it, and so it makes sense that a lot of these ideas would show up first in writing, in language, in that way, in science fiction, but. I was massively shaped by both Frank Herbert and William Gibson. They both were hugely impactful on my thinking about everything. And still to this day, but The Last Tango in Cyberspace, which is the sci-fi novel, has a ton of Frank Herbert references woven through because I'm a big Dune fan, and it was super impactful on me. But almost especially, my beat as a journalist when I was coming up for years was the transformation of science fiction into science fact. Right, that's what I covered, and that's what Tomorrowland was about. And so I was,
Right.
I met all those people, and I'm trying to think if there was anybody I met along the way who wasn't hugely influenced. Like you couldn't go anywhere without an Asimov
Right.
or I mean,
Right.
they were. The opposite would be unusual. Somebody who
Right.
wasn't influenced by science fiction.
It's a serious driving force in our science and technology, the fiction. It's a critical component
So
in what we do.
I think we've lost that edge. One of the reasons I wrote Last Tango in Cyberspace is because I kept going into bookstores and I would look for sort of like near-term future sci-fi, right? Um, and what was happening was everything was fantasy or really far future multi-galaxy spaceship stuff set 500 years away. And I was like, well, this isn't what, like, I was used to like something else. Like, what does it look like 5 years from now, 10
Something
years
more
from now, 50
tangible.
years from
Yeah.
now, right? And I think I think one of the reasons it went away, and I said this, I think when I was doing some of the press tour around Last Tango, is I mean, the technology is moving so quickly today. Peter Diamandis and I have a new book coming out called The Future is Faster Than You Think, where we look at, our other books looked at how individual lines of exponential technological acceleration were amplifying change in the world. And this book is about converging lines of exponential technology and so second order effects. And the big moral of the story is our acceleration is accelerating, right? Things are getting really, really, really fast. It's really hard to wrap your head around that, right? Like one of the
Yep.
reasons back to flow to tie these two things together, I think is, in Abundance and Bold, Peter Diamandis and myself, we pointed out that we have local and linear brains living in a global and exponential world. And that's literal, right? Our brains evolved in an era that is local and linear, and we live in an era that is global and exponential, and our brains can't keep up. And flow, because of what it does to information processing, is the only time you actually can sort of think at the speed and scale of exponential technology. So I think flow is really important in this sort of faster future. But I also think that's the reason science fiction sort of went away. I think it's really freaking hard to wrap your head around where we're going to be. I'll give you a simple example from Last Tango in Cyberspace. There's one line about cryptocurrency. It's set 5 years in the future. Clearly, cryptocurrencies are going to be around 5 years in the future. But when I was writing it, trying to predict what the hell blockchain would be really doing in 5 years was
Yeah.
so difficult, right? I couldn't put it in there. And it's in the future is faster than you think, because there are certain predictions that you can make safely, but they're not the ones that would be visible in a world. Like we know blockchain is going to be underneath our utilities, for example, right? Your electric bill is going to be, whether or not it's with a utility company or you're building your own solar, there's going to be a blockchain layer underneath it pretty soon because it's really well built for that. You won't see it. You won't even notice it. It'll be there. But like, what's it going to do to your daily life, right? Are you going to have your blockchain credit card when you go buy your latte at Starbucks? I mean,
You might,
you
but
know
you
what I
won't
mean?
think
I was
about it.
like,
You won't even see it. Yeah.
so I didn't know what to do with it, and I put a couple lines in there about blockchain, and I just sort of bailed. I was like, okay, I don't know what else to tell you here.
Right. You want your novel to be relevant in 5 to 10 years, and your work certainly will be. So, Steven, thank you so much. This is both fascinating and I think really important work that will change lives if people embrace it. So, I really appreciate your sharing it with us. Where can people find you and learn more about what you're doing and dig more into this?
So StevenKotler.com and theflowresearchcollective.com. And one thing I want to, what final thought before I let you go, because I didn't say this earlier, and I should have, which is flow is these enormous boosts: productivity, creativity, learning, motivation. They all go through the roof. It's optimal performance. And it turns out, this is really neat. This was not always the case. Like training people in flow, if you go into the literature up to like 2000, it was sort of a mixed bag. We were kind of crappy at it. And what changed is the neurobiology. We started to figure out, oh, this is where it's coming. This is mechanism. And then the triggers gave us even more neurobiology. So my organization, other people's organization, Flow Research Collective, we have a training called Zero to Dangerous. It's digitally delivered. And if you would have come to me 10 years ago and been like, dude, there's going to be an app, you're right, it's going to teach people flow through this course, how do you think I would have just started laughing, like, this will never work. And we measure flow using the standard psychometric interest for flow pre and post, and on average we're seeing like a 78% increase in flow. There's a substantial return to baseline on the back end based on, not really on flow stuff, but usually on motivation, grit, learning. There's some support structures that aren't always in place for people, but the point is this stuff is remarkably easy to train. So go to the Flow Research Collective. If you're curious about classes, we've got those, but there's so much free information. on that website. Dig in, train yourself up. A lot more is possible. That's the thing we learn over and over and over, is I think most people have no idea what they're actually capable of.
Thank you for sharing all these insights. Really appreciate it. And lots more for us all to dig into. Thanks, Steven.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, man.
And thank you for tuning in. If you're watching on YouTube, leave thoughts or comments below. If you found value in the show, please like the video so it gets promoted in the algorithm. Subscribe to the YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss the remarkable guest lineup we have in the pipeline. If you're listening to the podcast, ratings and reviews on iTunes or wherever you listen are massively helpful. They help us get promoted on those platforms. Be sure to subscribe to our newsletter to receive show updates, plus my newsletter essay and curated articles on transformational technologies. It comes out every 3 weeks. Everything is accessible at mindandmachine.io. Thanks. Until next time.